Hey guys, it's Winter Cosmos here. So I thought I'd try something a little bit different, and that's just reading some scary stories from Reddit while also displaying a scary game that I recorded. So let's go ahead and get started. I was camping with my husband and his family at a small remote lake in New Mexico. There was about 10 people in our group and another group of 6 people in the next campsite. It was a nighttime, and both groups were doing typical activities, making s'mores, having a few drinks, and telling stories, when we all heard what sounded like a little girl yelling for help. Neither group had children with them, but we were all positive we were hearing a little girl and decided to search the area we heard the noises from together. There was a field behind our campsite, and we all saw a very tall, pure white figure standing maybe 100 feet away from us in the field making the noises. We all agreed this thing looked maybe about 6 feet tall, skinny, and white as can be. We made our way closer to the investigation, but whatever it was that we saw started backing off as soon as we got closer. It disappeared into the trees. All night we continued to hear a little girl crawling for help as we tried to sleep. I'm a psychiatric nurse, and early in my career I worked at a residential mental health factory. One of our residents was an elective mute, which means that he couldn't, wouldn't, and didn't talk, but there was no medical reason as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He had been raised in the deep south and joined the military when he was 19, but one night he vanished and he was declared AWOL and eventually was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duche, not the real name, and I had been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he's ever spoken. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothing he had been reported to be wearing the night he had vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess, via fingerprints. The family was notified, but when they said that they had already grieved their lost man and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be, they demanded not to be contacted again." Marion paced all day every day, moving his mouth that looked like talking or muttering, but no sound came out. He had an unraveling habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If I talked to him, he would appear to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. Variety of medications were tried, but did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Miriam would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he would get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, the last thing I saw was Miriam pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laughing. Later, I wondered if all along I had been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. I was driving across country with my mom and sister when I was 16, and my sister was 20. It was late, but we were well rested still and alert. We were driving along an intersection and needed gas and a bathroom break, so we stopped at the only rest stop in 200 miles. There was a van full of teenagers on a road trip at the gas station, as well as a small gray car parked at the pump in front of us with 2 young men standing still outside of it. When we got there, everything felt wrong. We had been on the road for days and seen many rest stops at night and had never been afraid until then. My mom and sister went inside and I stayed in the car. I had heard the teenagers say that they were creeped out and couldn't get the pump to work, and they left in a hurry. I was watching the car in front of us, and the 2 men had not moved at all. Not an inch. They were not talking, and they were not on their phones. They were just standing there, still as a stone. My sister and mom came back out to the car, and when they got in, the two men slowly turned to look at us while not moving or pivoting the rest of their bodies, and I swear to fucking shit, we all saw the same thing. They had eyes dark as pitch and empty. Truly empty, not black, not reflecting any light at all. Just a void. We sped out of there and didn't stop until we were in the next city. The worst thing about the entire experience, we couldn't find the place on any map. We knew exactly which spot on the intersection to look, and we couldn't find it on Google Maps or on any paper map we had. We even asked locals about the creepy gas station out on the stretch of the road and got only confused looks. We traveled on that intersection since, and there is no rest stop. We were driving my friend's really old beat-up Subaru through a massive graveyard. We stopped and walked down a hill and came across a little pond. There was someone sitting on a rock on the other side of the pond. The figure was all black and we couldn't make out any features other than the fact it looked like a man who was wearing some old-style top hat. We stupidly waved and shouted, "Hi!" He didn't show any acknowledgement and continued standing still on the rock. All of a sudden, he jumped to his feet, started running to us on the water, and then vanished in thin water about halfway on the pond. My friends and I screamed and ran back to the car. The car wouldn't start and we heard something banging on the back of the car. It wasn't a constant bang, but every few seconds or so we'd hear it. No one was outside from what we could see in the dark, but something was making a noise on the car. I opened my phone and started dialing my mom to come give us a boost, but I had no service. None of us had any cell service. The next 30 minutes were spent trying to get her car started. No banging was heard afterwards, but we felt this heavy pressure around us. Finally, the car started and she hit the pedal to the metal. We sped out of the graveyard so fast, immediately crossing the gates, and all of our phones regained cell service. One thing I know for certain is that someone or something was out there, and it was not an animal or a human. When I was 37, I went to my high school reunion. I flew out into the nearest airport and rented a car. The distance was about 35 miles through a very remote and almost abandoned part of the country. About 3 miles outside of the town, I see someone on the side of the road flagging me down. It turned out that it was one of the guys that I had attended school with. Jim, not his name, got in the car and we started talking. I had not seen him in 20 years, but he still looked the same, maybe a little older. We got to town and I asked him if he wants to come to the VFW and have a drink, and he says, "No, just take me home." Jim's parents had only lived a few blocks from my grandmother's house, and I turned into that direction, but he said to take him home to the outskirts of the town. There was a mobile home park out of there, and I figured that is where he lived. When we reached the end of the turn, he had said, "Just drop me here. It was good to see you again," and he walked off into the night. I go to the VFW, meet some of my old classmates, and we start to talk. As soon as we were talking about who was coming to the reunion, I mentioned I had just picked up Jim up 3 miles east of town and had dropped him off. Everyone gets quiet. Even the guy singing karaoke stops and lays down the mic. My cousin goes white as a new t-shirt. "Barb, Jim died on that curve 8 years ago, rolled his car. We were all at his funeral," I was told. I started to feel really dizzy, and I went to the car to take some deep breaths. There on the seat is the local newspaper printed 8 years previously containing Jim's obituary, and I still have the paper. After we had moved into our home, we were told a woman had died there at the hands of her abusive husband. She hated men. My dad would wake up with scratches all over himself, and whenever my brother was mean to my sister or I, he would have scratches on him as well. One day, my brother hurt our sister. He hit her with something, and when he woke up later that night, he had a horrible bloody nose. The day we moved out, my brother accidentally broke his twin's arm trying out a wrestling move. He swears that he would have died that night if it wasn't our last in the house. I was standing in my parents' room talking to my very sick dad at the time. He was dying of stage 4 esophageal cancer. I got the feeling something was behind me.
I look towards the doorway to the living room, and something about 4'6" and fully black is peeking around the corner with its hands on the doorframe. I run towards it and it slipped back around the door. When I go outside the doorway, there was nothing there. My dad was completely confused when I step back inside the room when I tell him. People who stayed at my house in my dad's final days claim to have seen it. My mom saw the figure on multiple occasions in multiple places until he passed away. We haven't seen it since then. After my parents divorced when I was a teenager, I lived with my mother. I experienced lots of paranormal happenings. Several times when I was reading in my bed, the room would start to feel really icy. Next, it would feel as if somebody that hated me was staring at me. When I'd get that feeling, I would leave the room and come back an hour later. Sometimes during the day, I would see a shadow figure sneaking along my bedroom walls. Something in the flat was pretending to be my dog. I went into the room and heard a deep growl from under the bed. My dog wasn't capable of making a noise that deep. It sounded like either a really big dog or a man doing his best dog impersonation. Other times, my dog would whimper and pace in the room next to mine, but wouldn't come when called, as if he was afraid of something in the hallway. When I moved in with my father, the paranormal activity stopped. Shortly after college, I got married. We immediately moved into a basement apartment because that's all that was available within our budget. This place had a poltergeist, and my wife was terrified. Whatever resonated there with this made it clear it wanted to live alone. Dishes, glass, and other items would fly off the shelf. My wife was hit several times. There was always an ominous feeling like we were being watched. At night, we'd walk through the apartment in the dark, and there would be an insanely bright flash of light that would illuminate the entire room. One night while we were going to bed, as soon as my wife and I walked into the bedroom, we heard a voice from nowhere say, "My name, move." My wife looked at me and I looked at her and I said loudly, "You got it, bud." We moved out 2 days later and stayed with the family. The old woman who owned the place died a few months later and the house was torn down. It is still an empty lot to this day and nothing but grass and a tree. I still drive by it every now and again. My dad used to work as a correctional officer at a remote prison. He drove the perimeters of the property for his entire shift, where he would check empty buildings for runaway inmates. It was generally a boring job. One night, my dad was parked on a hill reading a magazine when he started to feel a throbbing in his body. He described it as the feeling you get when speakers are playing a song with a really heavy bass. He put the magazine down and checked his rearview mirror where he saw someone outside the truck. He grabbed his pistol and jumped out of the truck with his weapon drawn. Outside the truck, he realized it was a procession of Native Americans walking through the truck and directly through his seat, only to disappear at the exact spot he was sitting. He said it was clear they were ghosts because many of them appeared injured, and this went on for several seconds, and then the whole procession disappeared. He called the other perimeter guy on his walkie-talkie to try to explain, and the other guy almost immediately stopped the communication. Turns out the other guy had seen this before but didn't believe in ghosts, so he wouldn't talk about it. I worked as a forensic nurse in a hospital's locked-up unit. We had one older lady who swore she was being haunted and abused by a demon she would call. So many crazy things happened when she was on the unit. We would go into the room, do normal care, leave, and seconds later she'd start screaming bloody murder. We'd run into the room to find her looking like she had been in a fight with a boxing champ. Bloody lip, black eye, markings all over her body. No one ever saw her doing this stuff to herself. Things would get moved around the room by themselves, and at one point she was in a protective restraints because the doctor thought she was hurting herself. There was no way she could have moved or done anything to herself while in those restraints, but new marks would always appear, or her cart or tray would be across the room. The room was secure, so there was no way someone else was doing this. When we asked her questions, she would just say it was. After she was discharged, we always had trouble with that room. If there was going to be a rapid response or a code, it happened in that room. One night, a guard reported lights blinking on and off. It was that room. One night, a resident's bell rang at 2:59 a.m. When the user entered the room, the patient asked that they remove the dark figure without a face that was hiding in her bathroom. Shaken, they assured the resident that they had done so and returned to their desk. 10 minutes later, another resident's bell rang on the opposite end of the floor. Upon entering, this patient said, "There is a creepy man in my room with no face. You need to get him out." Once again, returning to their desk terrified, the care specialist asked that a nurse stay with them for the rest of their shift. At the age of 8, their family moved to a house bordered by a forest. Their dogs were immediately terrified of the forest and would bark while they stared at particular areas. At night, they would hear noises like people walking around in the forest behind their house and sometimes even saw shadowy figures. And then they began to hear knocking on their back door and windows. As things escalated, voices began to come from the woods that seemed to be impersonating other family members. This prompted them to build a fence in their backyard and install security cameras. Though the knocking and tapping continued, a culprit was never caught on camera. Someone walked in the back door on the final day they stayed in the house. They left after seeing the security camera footage that showed the back door open on its own. An intriguing insight into the end-of-life experience in the hospital. This doctor described a particular phenomenon that occurs towards the end of many patients' life when they see small children running around their bed and outside their door. The doctor explains that this is more common in the ICU, but that the pattern is very recognizable and the experience is very similar across all culture backgrounds and ages. Experienced doctors and nurses are used to reports like those from their patients and learn to expect their passing when they hear this. The post concluded by stating, "So if you are doing rounds in the ICU late at night and you hear some snickering or tiny feet running in the hallways, prepare because the call of code green or code red is about to sound off in the PA system." Even creepier are the scores of comments from healthcare workers beneath the posts that confirm their similar experience with this phenomenon. A user on Reddit Paranormal posted this hair-raising story about something she experienced in 2013 when she worked as an insurance claims inspector. She typically called her clients about 30 minutes before showing up for a site inspection. One day, she called a client's home phone to let them know that she was on her way, and a very old sounding woman answered the phone with what sounded like a poor static filled connection. "Hello? Can you hear me? Hello?" After she was disconnected, she called back. There was no answer. She then tried the cell phone number on file and a young woman answered, saying she was out but would return within 30 minutes. When she arrived, the insurance inspector rang the doorbell, thinking that whoever initially answered the home phone would answer the door. However, no one did. A few moments later, the young woman who answered the cell phone arrived, apologetic. The inspector explained that she might have woken up the younger woman's mother. The woman looked confused and scared and explained that there wasn't an older woman living in the house. After going inside, they checked the caller ID and discovered that when the inspector called, someone had answered the first call. The young woman became pale and terrified as she explained that she had recently moved into this home and had been telling her husband that she thought their house was haunted by an old woman. This user owned the original Furby when they were younger, and 10 years later they found it in their father's attic. At this point, it was pretty worn down. The plastic rubber on the nose was gone and its fur was pretty matted. They put it down and continued looking for what they originally needed in the attic. As they walked away, the Furby started to make an odd, distorted sounds. The voice was scratchy and unsettling, but they didn't think much of it. The toy was 10 years old and it had been moved and bumped around a lot. After it continued to make sounds, they walked over to it and discovered that there weren't any batteries. In fact, they realized there hadn't been any batteries for 7 or 8 years, which sent them running out of the attic, never to return. A user shared this interesting family ghost story from 10 years ago on Ghost Stories subreddit in June of 2022. At the time, he was 12 years old and jumping on a trampoline in his backyard. He could see his upstairs bedroom window and a woman in a white dress waving at him from his adjoining bathroom window. Thinking it was his mom, he went inside and discovered that his mom wasn't home. When she returned home later from running errands, he described seeing the woman in white in his bathroom. Because he was growing up in the same home as his mother, she admitted that she had also seen that woman twice when she was younger, as had his grandmother. He goes on to say, "It still kind of bothers me because I now sleep in the room with that bathroom, and I can see that same window from where I'm sitting right now." A user Excellent Reach posted this real-life story nightmare fuel on the Ghost Story subreddit in June of 2022. While babysitting his niece, he had drifted off while studying and watching her from the baby camera monitor. He was awoken by the sound of whispering coming from the baby monitor and immediately noticed the video on the monitor showed a dark figure in a corner of his niece's room near her crib. As he wrote, "I have never felt more terrified in my entire life." He ran into his niece's room and didn't see the shadow figure, but grabbed her and ran back into the living room. When his brother returned, he asked that he not to tell his wife and confirmed that he had also seen the same shadow figure and heard the whispers near the crib. They continued to live in that house for another 4 years, despite the fact that the little girl frequently talked about her special friend. My grandmother lives in a very stereotypical horror movie house, a small Midwest town, white and old looking home on a farm. She even has a chipped wooden Mary novelty in the front yard. She also has a cemetery about half a mile down the road. I used to sleep in the room in the corner on the top floor, my aunt's room, and it had a wooden rocking chair in it. When I was younger, I would wake up because I thought I heard it rocking, to the point where I would wake up my grandma and have to stay in her room. About 10 years later, my mom, aunt, and I were talking about how creepy my grandma's house was. My aunt goes on to talk about how when she was younger, the reason my mom and her ended up sharing a room was because she thought her room was haunted. She said she woke up one morning and the rocking chair was about 2 feet closer to her bed, and after that night, it would start rocking on a nightly basis at midnight. Until a few years ago, I still had a flip phone. One day, I got a random call asking for some girl named Sarah. I told them that they had the wrong number and they hung up. For the next few months, I would get these calls asking for Sarah about once or twice a week, coming from different numbers and different sounding people. Sometimes these calls came at 3 in the morning. One day I got a call, and like usual, I said I didn't know Sarah. After they hung up, I went to my contacts and hit redial. The answering machine said that the number did not exist. I went back through my call history trying to call some other people that had called me with the same result. A machine telling me the number did not exist. Every time I would get these calls, I would redial the number and still get the machine. I googled the numbers, but all I learned was that they were coming from North Dakota, Montana, and basically everywhere in the Midwest. The next time I got a call asking for Sarah, I said, "Oh, yeah, she's right here." And the other person on the other end said, "No, she isn't," and hung up. Things started getting weird when I started getting calls from unknown numbers calling me. Whoever or whatever on the other end hung up on the second I said hello. Once I got a call where they didn't hang up after I said hello, and I can hear someone on the other end just listening, but they didn't say anything, just something really uneasy about it. I was staying in the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, the oldest property on the strip with a sordid mob history. In the middle of the night, I woke and saw a dark figure moving around the foot of my bed and coming up the gap between the twin beds. I hit the light and there was a full figure of a man. in a 60s sports blazed with blood all over his face. I yelled, "Go away," and started flaring my arm in his direction, and just like that he disappeared. I woke up my friends in the other bed and my buddy said, "What the hell are you swatting at?" I told them and they laughed at me. The following morning my buddy said after I had fallen asleep, water was dripping on his head but there was no leak on the ceiling, and was convinced we may have shared a paranormal encounter. I had a black cat called Casper. We adopted her after she ran away from the previous owner. She was missing for days before the previous owner found her in the bushes, skittish and frightened. After carrying her home, the owner discovered she was allergic to cats with her arm broke out with rashes. She put out a call for a new home, which was answered by my animal-loving family. For ages, she was scared to come near anyone and was totally adverse to being petted. Eventually, she turned into a total ham, never missing the chance to jump on you and lie with you. We loved her, and I loved her heaps. Then one day, she lost the use of her back legs. Not long after, she passed away. I was having a rough time then, and she was a big comforter. Point is, my parents and I were sad. A few days after, I'm sitting on my front step having a smoke, and I hear a meow sound identical to Casper. I look out the front, and there at the gate was a cat meowing at me that looked just like Casper. I went over and it ran away. I looked down the street after it, and it was gone. I mentioned it to my parents. They both said the same thing happened to each of them separately, which was a surprise to them too. Now, it could have been a similar cat from the neighborhood, but it only happened once to each of us, and it was never seen again. When I was 16, I was riding horses with my friend in the field beside her house. The horse threw me and I hit my head hard. The next thing I know, I'm on my back in incredible pain, staring up at my friend who is frantically screaming at me. Dazed, my gaze shifted and then refocused on her friend behind her, the thin man wearing a black suit and an old-fashioned wide-brimmed hat. He was staring unblinkingly into my eyes over my friend's shoulder. Days later, she came to visit me in the hospital and I asked her about the man I had seen. I thought it was her new boyfriend she had recently told me about. She told me there was no one there but me and her. This past year, I went to bed on a normal night, and in mid-dream, everything stopped and a voice says, "The fire alarm is about to go off." I woke up about 5 minutes later when the fire alarm starts in our building. I asked my roommate the next day if anyone said that, and I just happened to hear it, but they said the alarm went off around 4 a.m., and they were all sleeping prior to it going off. Plus, none of us knew they were testing the alarm beforehand. I was weirded out after. Back in 2005, I was in a band that toured the country in a 15-passenger van with a trailer. We were on the way from Columbus, Ohio to Erie, Pennsylvania. The show had been canceled in Ohio due to a power outage, so we decided to get on the road early, as we had friends in Erie who were taking us in for the night. I'll never forget this moment for the rest of my life. We were all having a conversation. There was 8 of us total in the van when the driver and the passenger both shouted simultaneously, "What was that?" I'm getting goosebumps on my arm right now just remembering the event. I was sitting behind the driver with my back against the window and I didn't see anything, but we heard a swashing noise as if something flew right over the van. My friend who was sitting next to me looked like he had seen a ghost. We winded up pulling over on the side of the road because everyone was freaking out, thinking we hit something. Nothing was found. Both the passenger and driver said they saw a tall black figure lurking at the van from the shoulder of the left lane. My friend who was sitting next to me said the same thing. The next day, we inspected the van in daylight and noticed there were some screech marks across the roof of the van. When I was 14, I was staying up way too late on the computer. It was about 2 in the morning and everyone else was asleep. I got thirsty and wandered down the hallway to get a drink. I didn't bother to turn on any lights since there was a night light in the hallway and there was enough light to get by. I'm walking back to the bedroom when I get this weird feeling like someone is watching me and turn around. There is this big white mist just floating right behind me. I immediately turn around and went back into the safe, bright room. The thing is, there were no windows facing that hallway and I hadn't passed the nightlight yet, so it definitely wasn't a trick of the light. All the doors leading to the hallway were also closed. A few years later, when I moved to the small room closest to that spot, I get the heebie-jeebies and I couldn't sleep without a lamp on. It wasn't until sometime later after the sighting that I learned that in the 80s a guy was renting out the house. He was arrested for the kidnapped, blank, and disappearance of a bunch of kids in the area and for the suspect murder of his wife. They never found her and she supposedly ran away according to him. Cadaver dogs went over the farm, but they never found anything. The cops must have not done a good job, though, because when they moved in, my mother found a pair of boys' underwears in the toilet tank. The missing wife was never found, and he died in prison about a decade. I think she's still here, though. This happened to me when I was about 4 years old. We lived in a really small apartment that had 2 rooms. When you enter our room, you can just see the kitchen, and there's a doorway on the left, which is our bedroom. I was playing in the bedroom and got my slippers stuck under the bed. I can't seem to get it since there's only a 2-inch gap under the bed. I don't know what got into me, but I start chanting something like "slipper, get out now," over and over again. Then I got this feeling of dread and I got scared, so I ran away. After a few minutes, I snooked into the bedroom and found my slipper a foot away from the bed. I ran inside to get it and got out as fast as I can. I don't know how it could have happened. As a little girl with an overactive imagination, I just assumed a rat passed by, heard me, and just pushed my slipper out of there. When I was 7, I suddenly awoke in the middle of the night to a young kid kneeling near my bed praying. At first I thought it was my younger brother, so I asked him what he was doing. After I asked him, he slowly looked at me and stood up and started running. So I hopped out of bed and followed him down my stairs and out my front door. We had a long driveway and I followed him all the way to the end and then he simply vanished. I went back into my room and nothing like that has happened since. I was home alone and in the bath, but I had closed the door so that my dogs wouldn't run in and try to jump into the bath too. I was in there for a good 45 to 50 minutes, then I climbed out and opened the door. There had been a table moved right in front of the door. I've never heard a thing while it was happening. Never even heard my dogs bark, and they bark for anything. They were outside playing, which is so strange for them. When my boyfriend was about 4 years old, he would talk to a man he saw in the mirror. Naturally, his parents were very curious about his behavior and asked him questions about the man. He told his parents details about the man, including his appearance, hobbies, and how he died. It turns out that one of the former owners of the house was a man who had committed blank in the house, and he matched the description of the man my boyfriend saw in the mirror. When his parents found out, they moved out of the house a month later. I was visiting my dad last summer and trying to fall asleep when suddenly I felt a hand grab my ankle. I kicked furiously at whatever was grabbing me, jumped out of the bed, and screamed. There was nothing there. My dad came running into the room and found me sitting on the floor facing the bed. He asked me what was wrong and didn't believe me when I said nothing, that I had thought something grabbed me, and even checked the closet. I immediately felt embarrassed, but it felt so real. I've never had something like that happen before or since. As a kid, I was afraid of everything. Don't even get me started on the years I was convinced Pennywise would come out of my shower drain. When I was actually faced with the real thing at the age of 8, however, I was completely calm. At a routine sleepover at my aunt's house, I was sleeping in Lucy's daybed she adored with toys and dolls for me. Around 3 p.m., yes, witching hour, I woke with a start and noticed a shadow cast on the wall in front of me. A silhouette of a woman in a nightgown with the long hair appeared to be bending over as if to light a candle. "Aunt Caroline," I said, "what are you doing?" My aunt answered from her room just the next door asking if I was okay, and with that the shadow vanished and the room was black again. Calmly I explained to her what happened, and the woman,
who actually loves all things horror, freaked out and called her own mom, my grandma, to come to pick me up. It is one of the clearest memories. I have never questioned the existence of ghosts and never will. As a kid, my stepsister always told me that there was a little girl who would run around in the attic and keep her up at night. She said the girl would also come to her bedside and ask her to play. I always thought she was pulling my leg. It wasn't until years later I finally believed her. The first summer after all my siblings moved out, I spent a lot of days at home alone. Whenever I would shower, I would hear the bathroom door creak open and I would peek out the curtain and the door would be open, but no one would be there. I closed the curtain again and all the cabinets would suddenly start banging. I would open the curtain and the cabinet doors would be open, but again, no one was there. After this happened to me on several occasions, I was convinced my dad's house was haunted. I still don't like being there alone, even as an adult.